Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to HCM Impact, also known as Raise the Tide. This is a group of global experts talking about human capital reporting, ISO HR standards, TC260, and in particular, one standard that's really become a focus globally. And that is, well, Nicolai, why don't I let you do, I know you have been an intimately involved person with the development of this standard. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself and a little bit of the history of the standard, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Brad. Yes, I would like to do so. I'm Nicolai Dyroff. I'm a lawyer by profession. I'm a company lawyer. I'm employed with SAP SE since the last 20 years. But in the context of the standards, I'm representing the Goinger Kreis, which is a forum and think tank of people responsible positions from businesses and science who act as thought leaders and drive forward targeted initiatives for human resources and employment. My focus in HR is mergers and acquisitions. I'm now since almost 30 years working in mergers and acquisitions. It became part of my HR career, but which is my heart is on mergers and acquisitions. I had the chance to conduct many acquisitions in the past 30 years. And that's the reason why I got in contact with KPIs on people, and the reason why I am so interested in working in the standardization process at DIN and at ISO. I started with DIN in 2011, exactly 10 years ago, and in 2015 with ISO. And my interest is to develop globally standards for human reporting.
I love the background on so many levels. One is that I've been an instructor for HR certification for many, many years. And I remember 15 years ago when I was teaching courses and we would talk about mergers and acquisitions to HR people, and they would kind of gloss over, it was kind of like, this is very theoretical. This doesn't, and 10 years later, when I go into those same classrooms and say, how many of you ever been involved in M&A? It's like, at least half, if not 60% of the people. It's become such a foundation in the global work environment. And if you are a leader, if you are a manager, if you are someone in a decision-making position, the dynamics, the legalities, the economic efficiencies, the business case that relates to mergers and acquisitions is such a central part of leadership roles. So maybe a next question to follow up is so in that broader umbrella, how did you come to ISO 30414? Where did this become such a prominent, I'll call it tool or strategic tool that you've latched onto?
Yeah, so as I said, in the environment of mergers and acquisition, we all developed our own KPIs. And I was always looking for some standards which applies nationally or globally, and I couldn't find any. And I started even with the government of Germany to develop standards. I was asked to lead a group in the Ministry of Economy and to develop it, but it did not work out in those days. So I started in 2009, almost 12 years ago. Yeah. And in the Goinger Kreis, we said, no, we need those kind of standards, human resource standards, especially HR reporting standards, because we have to understand worldwide and talk the same language. And in the past, everything was focused on financial data only. But we know that we have to focus on the people. People makes a difference. No figures make any differences. We only can look back and understand our financial figures, but there were no figures who tells us how the future could look like. And so therefore, we started to develop those HR reporting standards.
Here's a question, and a lot of your colleagues that we've interviewed so far and will interview are our fellow German nationals. Why is it that Germany seems to be one of the hubs of this activity? I mean, I'm not, maybe there's an anecdotal answer, maybe you have a research-based answer. I'd be curious to know, how is it that Germany is leading the charge on this?
Actually, it was an anecdote. Actually, it was a competition between the British, the American, the German, who are the
I like it.
first in bringing up a draft version for globally applied standards. So actually, literally, Stephanie Becker and I wrote the draft version. So the so-called new work item proposal for ISO, and introduced it to the global community. And believe it or not, they all said, oh, that's great. And that's the best thing we have ever seen. It was just the draft version. And there was even an internal measurement to existing reporting standards. And they found out that our draft is even better what was available worldwide. So we were very proud of receiving this recognition by our dear global colleagues. That was a starting point. We understood from the very beginning it was a German thought how to get started, but we knew that the global interests are completely different to the German interests.
Yes.
And therefore, we just brought it to the international table and start, please just think about it and please add what you think is missing, what is wrong, what you need to adopt and change. And we started a very interesting discussion without any fights and nasty discussions, which I usually know from the German national board, with standardization board, where we had some different interests. So all those people are acting the same direction. That was the starting point. And as I said, we started talking about it in 2015. Now it's 6 years later. In 3 years, we have the standard. And now we are already considering what can we do better in the future with the standard.
Yeah, I'm going to save that question towards the end to ask you, but that's such a great story. And I think, I don't want to, speculate, but, I'm a Canadian, obviously growing up next to the big elephant south of the border of the United States. I never thought that as an HR professional that this idea of international standards sort of would have it be sort of incubated from the United States. The US sort of started this project with ANSI and some other people that are part of our HCM impact group. And yet what I've enjoyed and what you've alluded to is this collaborative effort. And maybe that's part of it is the German culture, works council, sort of this more stakeholder involvement that Germany might be ahead of other markets, which are a bit more individualistic or litigious. And I think that, again, I don't want to speak for you, but I think that probably really helped you present to the global community, I'll call it better practice or good practice in terms of universal value add for HR. Is that fair comment?
It's a fair comment, yeah. But in Germany, you're absolutely right. We are dependent on co-determination. We have social partners and business partners, so the works council and the unions. And we are brought up in just involving them in all our ideas. On the one side, it's a little bit slower. Yes. But at the end, if you get more insight in it, especially from an employee's perspective, you only can do better with them. And I started to even deal with the union 30 years ago when I joined Lufthansa. I spent 80% of my working time just to negotiate with the Works Council. And it was, once in a while, it was annoying. But once we look at the result of it, we always thought, okay, now we are definitely better from both ends. And we had to buy in from the employees too.
Yeah, I mean, that long-term thinking and collaborative HR was sort of a theory when I was in university early on. And, I think one of the great success stories of the German model was in the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, where you had, some Western companies, big going bankrupt, and some German companies getting together and say, hey, let's get through this together, and a more collaborative approach on how to be sustainable in the broadest sense. So coming back to this idea of the ISO 30414 standard, you have a great article on the HCM Impact website, and I encourage everyone to read that article. But definitely related to that article is sort of what are some of the misunderstandings about either standards or this particular standard? And I'll let you start wherever you want.
It's a very good and very important point you tackled. There, a lot of discussions around it, especially in the German board, the German Standardization Board. Do we really need it? Those questions were raised by the employers associations. They tried to stick to their old ways how to act on human resources, how to deal with people. And we said, no, we have to change this. It's a little bit old-fashioned. And the comments were, it's too complicated. We have so many obligations where we need to provide reports from a government side. So it's just too much for us. It's too cost intensive. And on the other hand, we don't want to disclose our weaknesses to our competitors.
Yes. Right.
Why shall we do this? We are once in a while, for example, the banking sector said we are in a situation where we have to compete with other global banks, with national banks, and we are in a process where we have to change our business processes. And exactly now you ask us to disclose our weaknesses, so we are not willing to do so. We had a fierce discussion, for example, about one topic about employment costs. They only wanted to disclose direct employment costs, and that's only a half side of a coin. If you only disclose the costs related to employment contracts and you're hiding the costs for contingent workers, for contractors, for all kinds of other workers, you never know whether all you know is within the company or outside of the company. Right. And all employers need to know whether they have close they can really tackle the know-how or whether they're dependent from outside. And they tried to defend this position. At the end, they were not successful, especially not on a global basis. Another argument was we have developed our own process. I already mentioned that topic and our performance indicators, and they are so different to all others. And our argument was, no, once you talk about people, it can't be different. Because if you try to understand or to talk in a sustainable way, your approach is not sustainable because you try to keep what you did in the past, but the future is different.
Well, and I've been involved in and out of TC260 since the inception. Even before there was a TC260, I was working on the ANSI team in the United States. And one of the things I love about the international discussions between passionate people like yourself and others involved in this project is this, you sort of come to it. It's a classic sort of J curve of change, right? You come to it sort of with your frame of reference. You engage in a bit of friction in terms of trying to convince others as to your point of view. But then in a healthy communication sense, if you start to understand, or emotional intelligence, you get a better sense of where others are coming from, you start to see the common ground. And when you get to that place, it's kind of a eureka moment. And it's very empowering. And it's what I would argue real professionals do. In medicine and law, you don't create silos of professional practice. You have research, you have communities of interest, and imagine if the world treated the coronavirus, like something confidential or proprietary. We don't want to help others with this, but it is a huge challenge in HR, especially because often people like myself were taught at the inception that you are a fiduciary for an organization, and one of your primary responsibilities as HR is confidentiality. Add to this sort of the data protection laws and the health status laws and all of these things that are happening globally. It is an uphill battle to convince, especially HR people, of the net benefit of this standardization. So what have been some of the lessons you've learned, that you can share sort of in an anticipatory sense for others as to accelerate their understanding of the net benefits?
Thank you for this question. I really like it. First of all, for me, it was very important that I'm not representing SAP, because external people might think, okay, you're only acting on behalf of a big elephant in the software industry, and therefore we don't really trust you. That was very important for me. I was not supported by the time, not financially and not from a content perspective by my employer.
Right.
That was one of my first decisions I took, and I'm representing the Going Kreis, which is independent from it. That's one of it. Second one is, and that was a really an interesting process. We had to focus on 1 or 2 or 3 key targets. So, like the target, we are focusing on people only. We are focusing on the value contribution of people in organizations.
Yes.
We stopped talking about companies only because we have employed people in government, in NGOs, in all kinds of organizations which don't have a financial interest. Financial interest for sure is majority of all organizations, let's say 70%. But we tried to keep the focus on all kinds of employed people. And with this focus, it helped us quite a lot to develop those 58 KPIs to understand what is really important for sustainable employment. And we had a fierce and long discussion. What do we mean with sustainable employment?
Exactly.
Because there's no standard definition for it. But we defined the definition as sustainable employment if the work is needed in, let's say, 1 or 2 or 3 decades. If we still have work for our children and grandchildren, and they still love their work, and they don't are employed in the situations that they hate their work, they really must be in favor of what they do. And this must be embedded into the changes the world is facing each day, every day. And that's part of the sustainable definition we try to implement in this discussion.
I loved, and I'm not just saying that, I loved that definition you gave, because when that discussion was taking place, I was indirectly involved, and I was, I don't even think I was living in the Middle East at that time. I was based in North America. And I can remember going back to North America and discussing with my friends, colleagues on this project, the European mindset on sustainability, because I think and I don't want to speak for a continent, but the bias from a North American perspective was, this European definition of sustainability was so broad and all encompassing that it was just incredibly vague and very hard to wrap your mind around. And I said, no. Like what you just said, Nicolai, in terms of the definition you just used, I said, it's a philosophy about the community and the responsibility of organizations and the individuals in those organizations, which ought to be a universal principle from my point of view. So it was a wonderful example, again, of the collaboration of this project, where like-minded people are getting together and saying, wow, you know what the human beings are doing in organizations, however you benchmark that, people, HR, is the value add, and increasingly, of organizations globally. It's not the things, it's the people. And so the case, the business case, if you want to call it that, for human capital reporting and other TC 260 standards, definitely cruxes on this idea of transparency, sustainability. And I'm cognizant of our time. What can you share with us as to where this project is going from your point of view? I'm fully aware that there may be some things that you might not want to elaborate on at this point, because it is a group global effort, but I'm sure there's some people watching and listening right now that would be very curious as to sort of say, what's next?
Okay, what we are currently doing is to spread the good news. That means we're in the midst of a global go-to-market initiative. It's Race the Tide. It brings this understanding to all kinds of organizations. So we are very good in convincing the financial sector, so the big players. So we're more than convinced that it's important to understand the contribution of people to organizations, to act in a fair manner, to be compliant, and to be environmentally friendly. It's not our key focus, but it was the key focus of the big financial organizations. And we are not so good in yet in reaching out to the small and medium-sized businesses and organizations. So, because many people are employed there. For example, in the US, about 80% of people are employed in large organizations. In Germany, it's just exactly the other way around. So it's only 20% are in large organizations and 80% are in mid-sized and small organizations. So we have to give a support to, let's say, a bakery with 10 people. And when I talk to organizations of this size, say, oh, we don't need it. I say, okay, you might need it, but what are your major problems? Okay, it's either I can't get enough people to my bakery because there's another bakery next street who just took my best guys. And it's taking pretty long time until they get replacements for them. Okay, we are on the same page. It's exactly what you need to focus on. For example, you need to understand how to retain your people in your organization, your bakery, and for not losing it. What can you do for just being a good employer so people stay with you? That's one of the parts is it's a very strong focus on the individuals. At the end of the day, we're always talking about organizational success, which is money or which is something else. We should talk about a government job, for example. Right. But it always starts with the people. And therefore, we have to understand and we have to bring this understanding to all kinds of organizations worldwide. What could be the benefit? And why do you want to do this? As I said from the very beginning, now we have a global standard. And while using this global standard, we know immediately, okay, we're good or we're not so good. It's not so much understanding the weaknesses of your organization. You have to understand where you're good and where you're really strong in order to retain this situation, this process. If you only focus on weaknesses, it would not help. If you know that, oh, I'm really good at attracting people, I'm good at retaining people, I might be not so good in other things, but you need to focus on these two strengths in order to stay ahead of your competition.
Yeah, it's one of the examples I've been using to explain a bit of the sea change or the potential impact of these standards is most HR people who are generalists or comp specialists, for example, they sort of understand the benchmarking idea of internal and external benchmarking, right? You sort of have internal pay grades, but you need to benchmark against the market. And I challenge them. I say, can you imagine doing that process without those external benchmarks? What would be the value of the process, right? And it's like you're living in half of the universe. You're not living in the full world, and they get that part of it right away, is they realize that if you're only dealing with half of the market and you can be very good internally, and you could have integrity, your system could have so much balance and equity and all of these things that you're so proud of, but if you're paying 50-70% below the market, you're in trouble. And that transparency and that openness and that sort of comparables is the word I'm using. And I think you mentioned that in your article as well on our website. So again, cognizant of time, I also want to make sure, if there's anything that we haven't covered in terms of sort of our preemptive discussion that you wanted to share with the audience, please now let us know.
I have to think about it. As I said, my personal mantra is to display the contribution of individuals to company success or organizational success. And that should be a guiding principle for all of us once we talk about it. First, it's not about money. And I like your example with if you underpay people heavily, you will for sure lose them. But remuneration is only third reason why people stay or leave an organization. So it's first hand, it's your job. Do you like your job? Do you like your team, your managers, your organization? And the third one is the compensation and benefits you might get. So focusing on the first two ones is the organization you're working for, your individual job you're working, as that should be always in front of our mind. and not forget that this is key for all kind of success. In the past, we tried to focus on financial data only, but that doesn't give us any answers for the future. It only told us how good or bad we had been in the past, but it doesn't tell us, is a team, for example, innovative enough to make some severe changes? And as the market is changing fundamentally every 2 or 3 years, we need people who can adapt to those changes. And therefore, we have to do more, and not only focusing on payment is good and important, but many companies pay their employees pretty well, but they're still losing them. And whenever they have some hiccups internally, people tend to leave their employers and look for new opportunities. And we have to understand how to be closer to our people. And at the end of the day, it's all about figures. It's about KPIs. You need to understand it's not a single one. And that may be a key message I would like to give you too. If you look at those 58 KPIs, a single KPI doesn't tell you a lot, but the connection of 3 or 4 of the KPIs tells you a whole story. For example, if you look at the retention or about the turnover, the pure turnover date doesn't tell you a lot. So you have to mix it up with other dates in order to make a expectation or how the future could look like. And therefore, it's like the weather forecast. If you tell me the temperature, it doesn't tell me anything. I need to understand the pressure. I need to understand the wind, and then I can make weather predictions for the next days or forecast for the next days. And the same methodology applies here too. You need to understand a set of data you have access to, and then you can make very fair predictions.
I love your example of the weather, because I've used that before in different situations. I live in Dubai, which is fairly well known as a fairly hot climate, and occasionally humid, but not as humid as a lot of other places in the world. And many years ago, I flew in the summer from Dubai to New Orleans, and the temperature in Dubai was the high 40s, Celsius. And I flew to New Orleans, and the temperature was the low 30s, but the humidity was almost 100%. And I'll tell you, I would much rather be back in Dubai than in New Orleans on that day when it was. So those are really good examples in sort of this matrixed or indexed approach to the KPIs and the measures and metrics. Final thoughts before we close this out on maybe, in 2 years from now, if you're looking back, if you and I are having this discussion 2 years from now, what would be some of the examples of success? What would be your vision that we are actually raising the tide?
One success factor will be the number of certifications. We had a really good start on starting to certify mainly large organizations, and there is hunger on getting even more, and a number of colleagues are working in the certification environment because it shows that people like the standards, and they know that will be one of the most important business standards in the future. It's for bigger organizations, it's not a painful, it's a time-consuming process for the beginning. For smaller ones, it's definitely not, but for the bigger one, it is. And once in a while, they discover that they are not measuring some set of data. That's one part. The second one is, in 2 years from today, we should have a release of CO 414. So we are currently thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of the standard. And the certification process tells us, okay, that's a number which is easily to obtain. These are numbers which are not so important for the business, and other definitions are not clear enough. So when we were sitting at the table and developed those standards, we thought what could be best, but we need the feedback from the stakeholders. And not stakeholder feedback from the very beginning, which we collected too, but after a few years, they worked on it. we get feedback which we need to incorporate into the standard.
Makes perfect sense. I think especially when you're involved in the project, you realize it's a journey, not a destination. And, I hate to be cliche about that, but it's also the fact that, when you're raising the bar, you have to take the wins. And that, a group of 10 people around a table may have wanted something more, but they weren't able to come to consensus at that time. But if you got 6 out of 10, you move forward, you come back, you revisit, you discuss, and you keep improving. And I think one of the shocking things for me early on in this project was this idea of, developing international standards, and just this realization that when well-intended, smart, passionate people get together, it's not a minimum. It's not a lowest common denominator. It's actually quite impressive, sort of the benchmark that these people will come up with. And I think that shocks a lot of people who aren't aware of the project, get involved, look at the standards themselves, and realize this is more than just sort of a basic foundation. And for many organizations, as you alluded to, they may think they're doing a lot of these things, but they're not. And in the process of having a standard and having certification, for example, that's a way for all of us to sort of raise the tide. So Nicolai, thank you so much for your time today, your insights. The examples you gave today are a really good complement to a lot of the other speakers we've had so far. On behalf of my colleague Fahad here in Dubai, thank you for your time, and thank you for your contribution to this project.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Bye.